The year was 1886, and in that part of the Wyoming Territory, the world was measured in distance and hardship. For Alara Vance, the measurements had become sharper, crueler, since her husband Thomas had been taken by a fever 2 winters past. Her homestead was a small, defiant claim against the vastness of the plains. A clapboard cabin and a sturdy barn separated by 60 yards of open ground. This 60-yard space, a pleasant walk in the brief, glorious summer, became a treacherous, life-threatening gulf in the winter. It was this gulf that had occupied her thoughts, her plans, and now her labor, in a way that had made her an object of curiosity and, increasingly, of pity among her few neighbors. She was not building a fence or digging a trench, she was planting trees. It began in the spring, a full year after Thomas's passing. She had taken her spade and a bucket down to the creek that bordered her property, the place where the willows grew thick and unruly and the young aspen shot up like pale green arrows seeking the sun. She had spent days digging up saplings, not the thick, promising ones a man might choose for a windbreak, but the youngest, most pliable shoots, some no thicker than her thumb. She chose them with a careful eye, judging their flexibility, their vitality. Then, she had begun planting them in 2 perfectly straight, parallel lines, stretching from the weathered wood of her cabin's back door to the wide, dark mouth of the barn. The lines were 4 feet apart, and the saplings in each line were spaced no more than a foot from one another, a dense and seemingly pointless hedge that served no discernible purpose. Amos Kelleher was the first to stop. He was a practical man, a man who saw the world in terms of board feet and bushels, and what he saw on Alara's land made no sense. He reined in his horse, his wife Dora shifting on the saddle behind him, and watched for a long moment as Alara, her skirts smudged with dirt, carefully tamped the earth around another willow whip. "Mrs. Vance," he called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who had tamed his own quarter section. "What is it you're aiming to build there?" Alara straightened up, wiping a forearm across her brow, and looked at him without resentment. "A covered way, Mr. Kelleher. A path to the barn for the winter." Amos exchanged a look with his wife, a flicker of shared incomprehension. "A covered way? With them little switches? Ma'am, a good blizzard will snap those like twigs. It'll just make a mess to clear come spring." He was not being unkind. He was stating a fact as he understood it. Wood had to be thick and seasoned, posts had to be sunk deep, and roofs had to be braced against the crushing weight of the snow. This was the established wisdom, earned through bitter experience. What Alara was doing was not building, it was gardening, and a blizzard did not respect a garden. "It won't be a roof to hold the snow," she explained, her voice quiet but firm. "It will be a guide to shed it." This explanation seemed to confuse him even more. He shook his head slowly. "A rope, Mrs. Vance. You run a good, thick rope from the house to the barn. That's all a body needs. That's what we all do. Anything else is just asking for trouble." Dora Kelleher offered a different kind of judgment. It was not the practical skepticism of her husband, but the soft, suffocating cloak of pity. As they rode away, Alara could hear her voice, a worried murmur on the wind. "The poor thing. The grief has unsettled her mind, all alone out here, with such strange notions." That sentiment spread through the sparse community like milkweed fluff. Alara Vance, the widow, was no longer just a figure of sympathy. She was becoming a figure of concern, a woman whose sorrow had perhaps unmoored her from sense. They saw her strange, backbreaking work not as a project, but as a symptom. They imagined her freezing or starving, trapped by her own folly. and they rehearsed the sad stories they would tell about her come spring. Amusement was a safer position than outright scorn, and many chose it, referring to her project as Ilara's Folly or the Widow's Basket. Only Constance Hartwell, a widow herself over on the next section, seemed to hold her judgment. She brought Ilara a small sack of flour and a jar of preserves one afternoon, and walked with her along the lines of newly planted saplings. She did not offer advice or voice doubt. She simply watched Ilara's hands as she gently bent two opposing shoots toward each other, testing their give. "My William," Constance said softly. "He always said there was more than one way to stop a draft. He used to pack the walls with newsprint and mud. Looked a fright, but our cabin was the warmest for miles." She looked at the long green rose. "You have a reason for this, Ilara. I might not see it, but I reckon you do." In that quiet acknowledgement, Ilara found a small measure of comfort. It was enough. The reason was rooted deep in her memory, in a place far from the wind-scoured plains of Wyoming. It was in the dense, ancient forests of the Old World, where she had walked as a girl with her father. He had been a forester, a man whose knowledge came not from books, but from the living wood itself. He had taught her to see the forest not as a collection of individual trees, but as a single, complex system. One afternoon, sheltering from a sudden downpour under a canopy of interwoven beeches, he had pointed upward with his chin. "See, Ilara," he had said, his voice a low rumble. "A single branch is weak. It will break under a load of heavy, wet snow. A solid roof of planks, if it is big enough, will also break under that same load. But the forest does not break." He had made her trace the patterns with her eyes, to see how the branches of one tree grew through the branches of its neighbors, how they yielded to the wind, how the whole canopy moved as one. "It does not fight the weight," he explained, tapping his temple. "It divides it, it sheds it. Each branch lends its strength to the others, and the spaces in between let the wind pass through, so it cannot get a purchase. The snow piles on top, but it slides off the curves, it finds the gaps. The structure is strong because it is alive and because it is not solid. It is a sieve, not a dam." That principle had stayed with her, a piece of quiet, fundamental truth. Watching an outcome, seeing a rope guide a man through a storm, was not the same as understanding the principle of the storm itself. The men here knew how to build walls to resist the wind. Her father had taught her how to build a screen that would tame it. She had tried to explain it once more to Hiram Poole, who ran the small trading post. He had been delivering a sack of oats and stood, arms akimbo, staring at her work, which by late summer had begun to take shape. She had started bending the taller saplings from opposite sides toward the center, their tips overlapping. She used bits of twine to hold them in place, training them to form a long, continuous arch. "The snow will be too heavy, Ilara," he said, echoing Amos Kelleher. "It'll pile up in the middle and crush the whole thing flat." She had tried to use her father's words. "It is not meant to be a solid roof, Mr. Poole. It is meant to create a drift. The wind will blow the snow over the top, not into it. The shape is what matters. It will be a hollow space under the snow, not a structure trying to hold it up." He had just squinted at her, then at the sky, as if the idea was too foreign to even consider. He saw a flimsy collection of sticks. She saw the beginning of a living, breathing system designed to partner with the very forces it was meant to defy. His mind, like Amos's, was set on the logic of solid beams and right angles, of fighting nature with brute force. The idea of yielding to it, of guiding it, was a language they did not speak. The work was slow and methodical, a conversation between her hands and the living wood. As the first year turned to the second, the saplings took root and thickened. They were no longer individual shoots, but a connected system. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the needs of the tunnel. In the spring, she replaced the few saplings that had not survived the winter and carefully pruned away any errant branches that grew inward, keeping the pathway clear. In the summer, the real work of weaving began. She would spend hours under the dappled light of the growing arches, her hands sure and patient. She bent the new, supple growth from one side and interlaced it with the growth from the other, creating a dense lattice. It was like weaving a giant upside-down basket. She used the twine less and less as the structure began to support itself, the living wood holding the shape she gave it. The sensory world of the tunnel became her own. She knew the particular scent of crushed willow leaves, a green and bitter smell that clung to her palms. She learned the feel of aspen bark, smooth and cool like stone, and the rougher, grooved texture of the willows. There was the constant hum of bees in the summer, drawn to the leaves, and the whisper of the wind moving through the lattice, a different sound from the open roar across the plains. Her back ached, and her hands became permanently calloused, the skin thickened and tough. But there was a deep satisfaction in the labor, in seeing the two separate lines of trees slowly, painstakingly, become a single, unified whole. By the end of the second summer, the tunnel was complete. It was a long, green corridor, 60 yards of living, woven wood, a strange and beautiful structure that pulsed with a life of its own. It stood ready. That autumn, the signs came early. The geese flew south weeks ahead of their usual time. The squirrels were frantic, their caching relentless. The air itself felt different, thin and sharp, holding a deep, resonant cold that promised a winter of unusual severity. The old-timers felt it in their bones and spoke of the winter of '78, a season of legendary blizzards that had left cattle frozen upright in the fields. Ilara watched the sky, noted the pale, watery sun, and felt no fear, only a quiet, focused readiness. She spent her days securing her world. She banked the cabin with sod, chinked the last of the cracks in the barn wall, and laid in a formidable supply of firewood, stacking it high along the inside wall of her home. She made sure the path inside her living tunnel was clear of any fallen leaves or twigs. The structure itself was dormant now. The leaves dropped, a naked lattice of gray and silver branches against the bruised autumn sky. It looked more fragile than ever. The first blizzard arrived in late November. It came not with a gradual accumulation of flakes, but as a sudden, violent assault. One moment the sky was a sheet of iron gray. The next, the world dissolved into a churning, horizontal chaos of white. The wind shrieked, a physical force that rattled the door in its frame and found every tiny crack in the cabin's walls. Ilara lit her lamp, though it was only midday. Through the small window she could see nothing. The barn, the fields, the horizon, all of it had been erased. There was only the storm. This was the crucible. For 2 years she had worked, she had planned, she had remembered her father's wisdom. She had trusted the principle. Now, all she could do was wait. She tended to her small, ordered world inside the cabin. She stoked the fire, cooked a meal she did not feel hungry enough to eat, and mended a tear in one of Thomas's old shirts. The howl of the wind was a constant companion, a sound that seemed to want to tear the world apart. With every particularly violent gust, she thought of the tunnel. She imagined the fine, sharp snow, driven like sand, blasting against the woven wood. She pictured it accumulating, the weight building, and she had to consciously push away the voices of Amos Kelleher and the others, their confident predictions of collapse and failure. She had to trust the yielding strength of the willow, the flexibility of the aspen. She had to trust that the wind and snow were behaving as she had predicted, flowing over and around the curved structure, not gathering upon it. There was no way to know for sure. The outcome was invisible, sealed away by the storm. It was a pure test of faith in a principle. By the second morning, the storm had not lessened, and a new urgency gnawed at her. The animals. The cow, the 2 goats, and her chickens were in the barn. They had food and water, but they needed to be checked on. The cow would need milking. This was the moment the tunnel was built for. Taking a deep breath, she pulled on her heavy coat, wrapped a scarf over her head and face, and lit her storm lantern. She unbarred the back door, bracing herself against the wind. It shoved the door inward with a violent groan. Outside was not a landscape, but a wall, a solid, vertical wall of white. But it was not pressed directly against her door. There was a space, a dark opening at her feet. It was the mouth of the tunnel. Stepping inside was like entering another world. The deafening roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, transformed into a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the wooden structure around her. It was not silent, but the air was perfectly still. The fine, driven snow had packed into the lattice, creating solid, translucent walls, but the arch overhead was mostly clear, scoured by the wind. A pale, ethereal light filtered down, illuminating the narrow path before her. The lantern cast a circle of warm, yellow light, showing the way forward. She could stand up straight. The air was frigid, but without the wind, it was a clean, bearable cold. She held her hand out and touched the inside of the wall. It was solid, cold, and smooth as ice, the woven branches encased within the drift. The structure groaned under the immense pressure of the wind outside, a sound like a ship's rigging in a gale, but it held. It was yielding, breathing with the storm, not fighting it. She walked the full 60 yards to the barn, each step a confirmation, a vindication. The path was clear. She was not wading through drifts, not fighting the wind, not blinded by the snow. She was simply walking, protected. Reaching the barn door, she found it was mostly clear, the shape of the tunnel having created an eddy that kept the worst of the drift from accumulating against it. Inside, the animals were restless but safe. The familiar smells of hay and warm bodies filled the air. As she milked the cow, her hands moving with practiced rhythm, the enormity of her success settled over her. It was a quiet, internal triumph, a feeling of profound rightness. Standing there in the calm of the barn, listening to the muted howl of the blizzard outside, she thought of her father. He had not just taught her about trees. He had taught her a way of seeing the world, a way of solving problems by observing the deep, patient logic of nature. She had not conquered the storm. She had simply refused to fight it on its own terms. She had built a partnership with the wind and the snow, and it had worked. The blizzard raged for a third day before it finally broke. When the sun emerged, it was to a world transformed, a landscape of profound and dangerous beauty. The snow lay in immense, sculpted drifts, some as high as a house, burying fences and erasing roads. The silence was absolute. From her window, Elara saw a thin plume of smoke rising from the Kelleher homestead, but nothing else moved. An hour later, she saw a figure struggling across the field toward her. It was Amos Kelleher. He was not on his horse. He was on foot, plunging through the deep snow up to his waist with every step, a journey that should have taken 10 minutes, taking him nearly an hour. He was exhausted, his face red from cold and exertion when he finally reached her door. She let him in and sat him by the fire, handing him a hot cup of coffee. He drank it in silence, his chest heaving. "Our rope," he finally said, his voice raspy. "It's buried. Somewhere under that." He gestured vaguely toward his property. 10-foot drift between the house and the barn. Been digging for 2 hours. Haven't found the door yet. I saw your smoke. I couldn't believe it. I thought for sure you'd be—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "The animals are fine," Alara said simply. "I've been able to tend to them right along." Amos looked at her, his skepticism finally, fully collapsing under the weight of the evidence. "How?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alara said nothing. She just stood up and led him to her back door. She opened it. Amos stared. There, descending into the brilliant, sun-drenched snow, was the dark, arched entrance of the tunnel. It looked like a badger's den, a natural opening into the earth. The snow had not crushed it. Instead, the snow had become part of it, forming a long, smooth, aerodynamic shell over the woven frame, a perfect drift that rose from the cabin, crested over the tunnel, and tapered down to the barn. Amos walked to the entrance and peered inside. He could see the faint light at the other end, 60 yards away. He reached out a hand and touched the woven willow branches where they emerged from the snowpack. He ran his fingers over the smooth, hard curve of the drift. He looked back at Alara, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he said, the words coming out in a puff of frosted air. "It worked. It actually worked." He met her eyes, and for the first time, she saw not a hint of pity or condescension. "You were right, Mrs. Vance," he said plainly. "I was wrong." That admission was the beginning of a profound shift. The story of Alara's folly, now known as the Vance Tunnel, became the story of Alara's wisdom. When the thaw came, and the tunnel was revealed once more, greening with new buds, it was no longer an object of ridicule. It was a marvel. Amos was the first to ask her to show him how it was done, not just the weaving, but the principle behind it. She walked with him down to the creek and showed him how to choose the saplings, how to feel for the life and flexibility in the wood. She explained her father's lesson about yielding, about shedding the load instead of bearing it. He listened this time, his practical mind finally grasping the different, more subtle practicality of her design. Others followed. Homesteaders who had lost livestock, who had spent days snowed in and cut off, came to see the living tunnel. They saw how it connected her home to her livelihood, creating an artery of life that the winter could not sever. She shared her knowledge freely, patiently explaining the process, the spacing, the weaving technique, the importance of using living wood that would grow stronger and more integrated with each passing year. That spring, several other homesteads began planting their own double rows of willows and aspens. The sight of it was no longer strange. It was a sign of foresight, a quiet testament to a new kind of wisdom that was taking root in the community. The Vance Tunnel stood for more than 50 years. The saplings grew into mature trees, their trunks thickening, their branches fusing together into a solid, gnarled canopy that was dense and shady in the summer and an unbreakable, snow-shedding shield in the winter. Alara lived out her days on the homestead, her solitude no longer a source of pity for her neighbors, but a mark of her quiet strength and ingenuity. Her children, and then her grandchildren, used the tunnel, telling the story of the lone woman who had faced down a Wyoming winter not with brute force, but with the patient, profound wisdom of the forest. The principle she had brought with her from the old world had become an enduring part of the new one, a living legacy woven from willow, memory, and the simple, elegant truth that the most resilient things in the world are not always the most rigid.